One thing we know, in the last 15 years, multitasking and split focus has become even more common. And anybody who thinks that the brain can somehow be wired to absorb the same amount if it's doing 4 things at once, there's no evidence for it at all. When I turned my TV back on, I just started watching less of it, that's all, fewer hours of it. And it took the consciousness raising, to use that old phrase, to make me realize that I was losing a lot of the things I was supposedly reading because I always had the TV on. And the reason I had it on wasn't, that's what's so bad about this kind of video, is it's so passive. It was just there. I never even thought about why I had it on. It certainly wasn't because I didn't have enough to do or my house was too silent. And this is, and by the way, one of the things that's happened in the last 20 years is the proportion of, the number of hours the average American spends watching TV, 7, hasn't changed. But the number of people who say they watch whatever's on has gone up from 25% or so to 43%.
I got a feeling that has a lot to do with cable and that there's more stuff, more different things on. I think we're at a break point, and so when we come back, we'll talk a bit about your life and where these thoughts gestated. Well, I wanted to read from page 217 of your book, The Age of American Unreason, and to get your response.
You have me at a disadvantage.
Well, yes, I know. It's apropos of some of the stuff that we were talking about. But you write, finally, the virulent outbreak of anti-rationalism in late 20th century America is also rooted in a much older non-political tendency in American thought, a chronic suspicion of experts that dovetails with the folk belief in the superior wisdom of ordinary people. Let me ask you at this late date in human history, if whether you believe environmentalists or you believe evangelists, right? Where the rapture's coming one way or the other. We're going to be, the world's ending in fire and ice or something. But why shouldn't we be very suspicious of experts, particularly in the late 20th century, where you had something like Vietnam, where you had Watergate, where since then we've had a litany of every reason to believe that experts, particularly government experts or scientific experts, are wrong.
I didn't say we shouldn't be suspicious of experts. What I said is that this chronic suspicion of experts dovetails with these other forces. The chronic suspicion of experts is fine, but belief in the superior wisdom of ordinary people is not. What we need is, and what we don't have, is we have to have a way of evaluating which people really are experts and who isn't.
And now you don't feel like we have that through reputation, say in journalism. You're a journalist, I'm a journalist. One of the ways, any journalist can say whatever they want, but then you get a reputation based on the credibility of your source, maybe sometimes the credulity of your readers. But it seems to me across a wide variety of areas, such as whether we're talking about eBay or Amazon resellers or whatever, reputation is coming into its own.
No, you picked a bad example with journalists. It would be much more valid with scientists, because unlike journalists, scientists' conclusions are always being testified by real experiments with evidence.
Yeah, but I mean, you mentioned Paul Ehrlich, the author of The Population Bomb, who was spectacularly proven wrong in a 1970 book, predicting massive famine. It has not hurt him. He does not even acknowledge that he was wrong.
Oh, that's the difference, and these are the anti-rationalists on the left, by the way. Yeah. That is the difference, though, between science and non-science. The fact is, Paul Ehrlich has been proven spectacularly wrong about the ability of the world to feed itself. Whether he's been proven spectacularly wrong about it might be better for various countries not to have as many children is another matter. But the suspicion of experts is fine. But when you dovetail that with folk beliefs and hostility to evidence, we should be suspicious of experts who don't offer evidence, who only offer ideology for their conclusions. And by the way, intellectuals can be as impervious to evidence as anyone else. Look at what we have. The right-wing intellectuals who played such a role in rationalizing the Iraq War. the fact that it hasn't worked out doesn't faze them a bit. They say, well, it hasn't worked out, but it's going to work out. And intellectuals, some intellectuals on the far left also, when some of their ideas don't work out, they just keep going right on with them.
Who is an intellectual, a contemporary living intellectual, who you find is a model that other public intellectuals or that people can look at and say, okay, here's somebody who is thinking and is changing their mind based on evidence, etc.?
Oh, there are several of them, ranging from, let's say, Diane Ravitch in the world of, I call it the moderate right center world, to
an education specialist.
Right, right. Yeah. Arthur Schlesinger, who isn't alive, but he just died recently, so let's include him. People who even though they have liberal or conservative political views, are willing to look at the failure of some of the things they thought were true and say, let's try something else. Also, the mark of an anti-rationalist is the inability to learn anything from something else. There's this new organization called Common Core, which Diane Ravitch is one of the many people involved in, which is trying to set some national standards, curriculum standards for schools. It consists of people on the left and the right who are sensible and see that serious-minded people, unless they're way out in right and left field, ought to be able to cooperate on certain things, for example, on American history. And a great example of the spectacular failure to do so came in the 1970s, when, after all the turmoil on university campuses, what I call a shameful settlement was reached. And both the right and the left benefited from it. Instead of integrating Black history and women's history, this is not true of every university, by the way, I want to be careful. Some have done it well, but most of them haven't. Instead of integrating those sort of multicultural histories into American history, where they belong, because everybody needs to know things about African American history and women's history, what they did was they created a multicultural studies ghetto. This satisfied the left because it created a whole lot of new tenured jobs, and it satisfied the right. People like Alan Bloom, for the late Alan Bloom, who were able to go on teaching history as though it was only the history of white men, just the way they wanted.
It's interesting, because I think literature departments, which are often held up as a paragon of PC, and as somebody who went through grad school and kind of the high watermark of PC, often get criticized, but I think they've actually, American literature in general has done a pretty good job of integrating
they've done
old sources. Yeah.
They've done better than history.
Let me talk a little bit with you about junk science. You talk about vaccines, and you had mentioned before kind of people who remain anti-vaccine. Talk a little bit about that and how that's a sign of an American unreason.
Well, there is a very powerful anti-immunization movement in this country. Just in March, we have an outbreak of measles in California because so many parents who believe that vaccines may cause autism are using an exemption. The goal of this movement is to make all immunization voluntary, which, in my view, and in the view of all responsible doctors and scientists, could return us to the bad old days of 60 years ago, when thousands of children died of polio, when tens of thousands were crippled because of polio. I'm old enough to remember that. Now, what these people argue is that when these shots are given mostly around age 18 months to 2 years, this is also the moment at which intelligent parents notice the first signs of autism. They don't.
Can we say observant parents?
Observant
not
parents.
Intelligent parents.
Observant parents notice the first signs of autism. Coincidence and causation. There have been many medical studies done in places like Denmark where they have really good public health records and compare the rates of autism with children who have been immunized and those who haven't. They show exactly the same rates of autism. Now, it is understandable, and horribly, I was interviewed the other day by someone who does have an autistic child who really took me to task for this, but I can't say otherwise. What television does then, and this is why I'm so adamant about the role of the video world in suppressing rational argument. Every time they discuss this, they put a parent on, a heartbroken parent, understandably, who wants, because we don't know what causes autism, who wants to believe that this coincidence is a cause. And then they put a scientist on who cites these studies that show, very large studies that show there is no difference. And the implication is always the truth is somewhere right in the middle.